outset, I would like to thank the Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society for accepting our IEC. And today I have my esteemed panel with me, and all these glaucoma specialists with me will be discussing everything which is not glaucoma. And I hope this IC will help you identify the issues and help you in differentiating non-glaucomatous causes from glaucomatous causes. We'll be addressing the intraocular pressure, gonioscopy, optic nerve head evaluation, especially in myopic eyes, the OCT, and non-glaucomatous visual field defects. So we'll start with the first talk for today. Let me please call upon Dr. Shilpa Tiwari. She'll be speaking on intraocular pressure measurements and how do we do it correctly. Dr. Shilpa.
Yeah. Is my screen visible now?
Yeah, please go to the presenter mode.
Okay.
And for the sake of keeping time, I'll just let everybody know whenever they have 1 minute left for the presentation. Thank you.
Shall I start now? Is visible?
Please.
Hello?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah, click play. Click play.
Good morning. Sorry, can I interrupt till she starts? Good morning, Nangya sir. Good morning, Dr. Gunjan. Good morning, Ashish.
Yeah.
Good morning, madam.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to speak about IOP measurements. Yeah. Why tonometry? As IOP is the only modifiable risk factor in glaucoma, and it is the most important factor which we regularly follow in the patients of glaucoma. Tonometry is basically of three types: indentation, applanation, and non-contact. I am going to talk mostly about applanation as we routinely use that in our OPD. Applanation tonometer, it's a gold standard. Goldman is the gold standard method of tonometry. As we all know, it's based on Inverse-Fick's law. The pressure inside a sphere is equal to the force required and the area of flattening. But few things we should consider in a routine busy OPD, which we usually forgot. Like we should always explain the procedure to the patient that the small cylinder will come close to your eyes and it will not harm you. The patient should be instructed, should be at comfort level. Chin should be at the properly capped at the chin rest, and the lateral canthal should be at the lateral arms of the slit lamp. The room illumination should be dim, and the cobalt blue filter should be at full illumination with obliquely placed arm. And it should move slowly towards the patient till it touches the apex of the cornea and two semicircles are noted. Now, these are the list of factors which affect the IOP measurement. I will be coming shortly in taking one by one. First, most important is use appropriate amount of fluorescein. There should be adequate amount of fluorescein dye in the precorneal tear film, because if there are excessive tears and it's broader, it will lead to overestimation. And if the rings are fluorescent dye is less, the rings will be thinner and it will lead to underestimation of the pressures. Few studies showed that if tonometry is performed without fluorescent dye, then there will be underestimation of the intraocular pressure. Ask the patient to blink and wipe off excess tears if the Myers are thick. Now, the dial pressure. In the first picture, it's showing the dial pressure is low. The inner edge of the ring should be adjusted so that the inner edges just touch each other. And if in the third picture, as we see, the dial pressure is too high, so we should reduce the dial pressure. In the middle picture, the position of the probe is too high, so we should adjust accordingly. Now, the most important corneal factors. I'm taking the important corneal factors as corneal scars and all that. We all know Goldman gives a false reading in that. The effect of corneal curvature is very important, as we know steeper corneas needs to be indented more to produce a standard area of contact, which is 3.06 in Goldman, necessitating more force and higher IOP. So with the rule, astigmatism leads to underestimation, and against the rule, overestimation of IOP. So for 1 mm Hg of pressure is more recorded for every 3 to 4 diopters of corneal astigmatisms. To avoid that, over a range of 40 to 49 diopter error diopter in corneometry, we should align the tonometer to 40 to 43 degree to the axis of astigmatism in negative cylinder, and which is given in the red bar on the Goldman applanation. There are various studies showing that the effect of corneal curvature reduces to least when we do this thing. Now, the effect of corneal edema. As we all know, there will be underestimation, and the edematous epithelium is easier to indent than the normal epithelium. Effect of corneal thickness, we are usually routinely taking care of this. On all glaucoma persons are taking care of this. So thicker cornea will lead to artificially elevated IOP, and thinner artificially decreased IOP. This is the important thing. External pressure on the globe should be taken into consideration, as it leads to overestimation of the intraocular pressures. So first of all, we should hold the lids gently. As far as possible, we should try to hold only with the upper lid with the thumb. And if needed, depending on the patient's cooperability, we should hold, but it should not press your globe. So squeezing of eyes, small fissures, dermatochalasis, blepharospasm, and these things will lead to even tight collars also lead to artificially increase in IOP. These are the small things that we should take these things into consideration. Now the position of eye, even 15-degree uplift of the eye will lead to false recording in IOP. Centration should be perfect. Paracentral, even a little bit of paracentration will lead to false recordings. Repeated attempts, this is very, very important. It's studied that repeated attempts of intraocular pressure recording leads to underestimation, and inter-observer variability is also an important factor. Now, calibration. This is the thing which we usually forgot in our routine day-to-day practice. We should do calibration on a routine basis as advised by the machine user manual. Is different for different machines, but we should make a checklist for this in our routine day-to-day practice. Now, a little bit about Perkins. It is also based on the same procedure, but it is advantageous as it is handheld, can be used in infants, children, and recumbent patients, portable, and it's battery operated, so does not require electricity. Now, a little bit about non-contact tonometry. It uses a rapid air pulse to applanate the cornea. So IOP is estimated by detecting the force of air jet. It is fast and simple screening tool, and usually correlate well with the Goldman tonometer, but patient position fixation is also a very important thing while measuring this, and it is, as it is non-contact, so it is reduces the potential for disease transmission. This is a small video as we see. How fast is this? But just look at this.
We'll just wrap up your presentation, Dr. Shilpa. Please finish your presentation.
Yeah, it's giving error and suddenly it recorded the reading again. So in these types of cases, we should instruct our technician that you should repeat 2 or 3 readings in such type of patients. And it should be instructed to the patient that a rapid air jet will be coming at your eyes and it will not harm you. So don't be afraid of that. These few basic things will lead to an increase in IOP measurements, techniques, and its validity actually. NCT is usually done by non-paramedical staff, so we should train them and also take a review and take multiple readings in NCT to get a proper reliable reading. Transpalpable tonometer is basically used in special conditions like corneal astigmatism, edema, caponus, flat AC, and contact lenses. A word about new methods. The ocular response analyzer, it works on the principle of corneal hysteresis. So it is less influenced by corneal thickness and resistance. Pascal dynamic contour tonometer, it depends on contour matching. I'm not going into details about all this. We should take special care while we are tackling the patients of keratoconus. Off the cone measurement of IOP should be taken either with applanation or with pneumatic tonometers. In flat AC also, applanation gives a falsely high reading, and in post-LASIK patient, pre and post-LASIK IOP reading should be adjusted, and a formula with correction factor should be added. So the take-home message is regularly check calibration of your tonometer, and if you suspect any error, recheck with different machine if possible with you. Use appropriate mixture of local anesthetic and fluorescein. Good illumination. Eye should be in primary position, and correct position of the patient is very, very important. Compensate the corneal astigmatism, and if astigmatism is greater than 3 diopters, adjust the readings accordingly. Consider checking central corneal thickness, which we are usually regularly doing, and do not consider IOP in isolation. We all are taking dose changes, perimetry, and other factors. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Shilpa. And can I now call upon Dr. Aditya Deo, who is speaking on gonioscopy, and he'll be touching on misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis both. Dr. Aditya.
Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yeah, it is visible. I'll let you know whenever there are 2 minutes left. Huh?
Yeah.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society and Dr. Gunjan ma'am for giving me this opportunity. I will be talking mainly on gonioscopy and what to miss and how not to miss findings. We all know gonioscopy is often neglected, especially if the patient does not appear to have narrow angles. It is an essential diagnostic tool that aids in diagnosis of many conditions, including glaucoma, trauma, iris abnormalities, foreign bodies, and mainly conditions causing ocular ischemia, including diabetes. So before going to abnormal findings, we should be able to we should know the normal angle structures, because knowledge of skilled gonioscopy is important in preventing artifactual observation. And we should be familiar with large variety of normal and abnormal findings along with stable focused image. So the normal angle structures we should look for is from anterior to posterior, the Schwalbe's line, then and non-pigmented trabecular meshwork, pigmented trabecular meshwork, scleral spur, and ciliary body band. We all do in our OPD mostly indirect gonioscopy with 3 mirror and 4 mirror. That is the Zeiss and Sussman type. I personally prefer 4 mirror gonioscopy because it is convenient, no coupling agent is needed, and no need to rotate the lens, and indentation gonioscopy is important. So before going to non-glaucoma, we should first, we mainly use gonioscopy to diagnose angle closure. So the main part of gonioscopy is indentation. So in this video, you can see once we indent with the gonio lens, the angle opens up. So indentation gonioscopy is very much important to differentiate appositional from synechial angle closure. But we should not also do excessive indentation, because it can falsely open closed angles. If we are able to see folds in the cornea, then we understand that we are indenting excessively. So proper indentation is also required. Also, the amount of light going inside, the amount of light and slit width is also important. The slit beam should have least possible illumination and magnification. It should be small in size, 2 millimeter width. Here in this video, you can see now the angle appears closed, but once the slit width and the light are going inside the eye increases, the angle opens up. So in this such cases, we can miss angle closures. So angle closure can be missed if gonioscopy is done in bright lit room and with wide slit. And some people have widely open angles in bright light, but impressive angle narrowing in dim light. So this factor also is very important while doing gonioscopy. Few cases I'll discuss. Here this part of the angle is closed and some part of it is open. So if there is a pigmented Schwalbe's line, then we might miss a closed angle. If we see a pigmented Schwalbe's line, we are mistaken and we take it as open angle. So in these cases, corneal wedge technique, this is also very important technique to master. In this, narrow beam is thrown slight offset, and when the anterior and posterior beams meet, that is the Schwalbe's line. So if these beams are meeting at the iris or at the root, then we can confirmly say that it is angle closure. So this is also important technique. So after we know the normal angle structures and before diagnosing angle closure, indentation and corneal wedge technique is very important to be mastered. In this video, you can see once indentation is done, the iris is wrapped around the angle structures. The angle opens up. But classic, you see here the convexity, then a concavity, and then again a convexity. Classical double hump sign, which is seen in plateau iris. So plateau iris also can be mistaken for angle closure. So it is very important to do indentation and gonioscopy, so that because plateau iris and angle closure, the management differs. Take a look at this angle. This angle is heavily pigmented. So it might be mistaken as angle closure, but the angle is open actually. Angle structures are visible. So because of heavy pigmentation, it can appear as pseudo closed angle. Gonioscopy is also important after doing PI. In this case, there is this pupillary block post uveitis. Multiple PIs have been done. Post PI, to check whether the angle has opened up or not, gonioscopy has to be done. So in this case, you can see the angle has opened up. There are some PAs in patchy pigmentation suggests the closure and inflammation. So in such cases also, gonioscopy helps. And we should not just restrict gonioscopy for detection of angle closure alone. This is a case of pigmentary glaucoma. You can see the Krukenberg spindle, and on gonioscopy, heavy pigmentation, uniform pigmentation, and a pigmented Schwalbe's line, Sampo-Lazy line. Pigmented Schwalbe line can be present in pseudoexfoliation also, but the trabecular pigmentation is more granular. So if these signs are missed, if gonioscopy is not done in open angles, then we might label this as a open angle glaucoma. It is, but it is a pigmentary glaucoma. The most important, gonioscopy is needed for ruling out neovascularization. Here normal angle structure is seen, but this, if you see the fine vessels which cross the scleral spur, and so it is very important to differentiate between normal blood vessels and neovascular vessels, and gonioscopy helps in that.
Yeah. You have around 1 minute. No?
Yes, ma'am. We can miss a streak hypopyon also on slit lamp examination. In this, you can see a small streak hypopyon on gonioscopy. So gonioscopy is important in such cases also. In trauma, gonioscopy is very important, because the person might forget the history of trauma, but the angle never forgets. So here you can see a white ciliary band, the white sclera is visible, some patchy pigmentation, but we should always compare with the other normal eye. If we don't do this, we might miss these findings, and we label it as open angle, but actually they're angle recessions. And take a look at this gonio photograph. This looks like a neovascularization. There is atrophy on UVA, some blood on the iris, so we might label it as neovascular glaucoma. But on external examination, you see some uveal tissue incarceration superiorly that is causing that picture. And such pictures also are seen after post-hyphema. So gonioscopy helps you in diagnosis of previous trauma and hyphema. And post-surgery also, gonioscopy helps. This patient presented with signs of inflammation like UGH, but on gonioscopy, we found there is a haptic inside the angle. So, and post,
Can you please wrap up?
just I'm almost done, ma'am. Yeah. And to check patency of internal ostium after trabeculectomy, gonioscopy is very important. So, to summarize, gonioscopy is a very useful skill to master, and it should be done in all suspicious cases, maybe it be open angles or closed angles. We should be aware of all normal angle structures and their variations. And in unilateral glaucoma, gonioscopy is very important, and we should master dynamic gonioscopy, corneal wedge technique, and it is must in all diabetics, vascular occlusion patients, and potential causes of ocular ischemia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aditya. It was a very nice comparison, both of photographs and your videos. We'll come back to discussion later on. Can I now please call upon Dr. Vinay Nangia, sir? He was the past president of GSI, and he'll be talking on the mystery of the myopic optic nerve. Nangia, sir, please.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's excellent. Okay. Just give me a second. Can we, Okay, so thank you very much to the MOS and to Dr. Deshpande for allowing me to participate in this meeting. And I'm going to talk to you about the optic nerve in myopia. And I think all of us know that we struggle with the optic nerve every time we have a patient that we suspect may have glaucoma. So So the prevalence of myopia is not yet very high in India, and in the Central India Eye and Medical Study, which is almost a decade old now, we found in those over the age of 30, they had a prevalence of myopia of 17%, that is including all subjects that had more than minus 0.5 diopter of myopia actually. But when we look at what was the prevalence of myopia, more than minus 5 diopter, then we find that the prevalence was 1.8%. If you compare that with Singapore or with Chinese studies, then we find that the prevalence of myopia of more than minus 5 diopter was much higher. And today in China, Taiwan, and many other countries in East Asia, we find that the prevalence of myopia reaches almost 90% by the age of 18 or 19 years, actually. So I think that is something that's really tremendous in terms of the prevalence. So this is a study that I'd like to begin with. And you can see here that they studied subjects with myopia with less than 26.5 millimeter of axial length, and they found that the prevalence of about 12.2%, and when the axial length increases to more than 30 millimeters, then you find that the prevalence increases to 42% actually. So that is the importance of axial length in myopia and its association with glaucoma. So we studied almost 200 eyes, and we took axial length in group 1 of less than 23.5 millimeter. That was based on the fact that in the Central India Eye and Medical Study, which was done on almost 10,000 eyes, the mean axial length was about 22.6 millimeters with a standard deviation of 0.9 millimeters. So we considered 1 plus standard deviation as being normal axial length. And when it went beyond 23.5 to less than 24.4, that's 2 standard deviation. And then the group 3 was axial length of more than 24.4 millimeters. So you find that there were much more patients that had an axial length of more than 23.5 millimeters in this study group of patients from our clinic, indicating that axial length has a significant influence in the development of glaucoma. The second important thing was that these patients of myopia were significantly younger than patients that did not have myopia and fell into the axial length, normal axial length group, actually. It was also important to see that the central corneal thickness was a little bit thinner in these eyes with higher axial length, and the Brooks membrane opening was a little bit more in these eyes. And we know that at least some patients, if not all, do tend to have a larger optic disc area. So there was a significant RNFL and minimum rim width loss in the subjects. The increasing axial length was significantly associated with younger age, indicating that myopia leads to greater susceptibility to developing glaucoma earlier. We also found that the presence of gamma zone increased with axial length, and that beta and gamma zone may be associated together when you have glaucoma in myopia. The CCT was less in subjects with myopia, actually. And the BMO, the Brooks membrane opening, was more in subjects with myopia. The exact implications of these findings need to be studied further, but it's fairly evident that this is something that we need to keep in mind every time when we have a glaucoma patient in our clinic. So it's not merely just having a obviously myopic patient in our clinic, but it's about having a glaucoma patient in our clinic and then going back to study whether the axial length is increased, and knowing then therefore that this patient is myopic and the parameters correlated with it. So this is just an example of glaucoma and myopia. This is a 56-year-old gentleman who had significant glaucoma, and the axial length was about 25.6 in the right eye and 25.7 in the left eye, actually. And I'm just taking you through this patient just to show you some classical features. So the red arrow indicates the border of the so-called beta zone, the green the border of the gamma zone, actually, and you can see the presence of an epiretinal membrane in this patient, which is quite common in such patients. And then this is the retinal nerve fiber layer that's showing thinning superiorly. And what is really important is this area that I will just show you in the next photograph.
We have around 2 minutes more.
How many minutes do I have?
So 2 minutes more.
Okay, so you can see that even though there is significant thinning, the ganglion cell heat map and the deviation map shows you increased thickening in this area, actually. And the reason for this increased thickening is because there is almost fluid spaces, actually, that one might call retinoschisis in this area, causing incorrect segmentation and the appearance of thickening of the ganglion cell layer, actually. So the disc size differs significantly in myopia, and sometimes it doesn't show a correlation with high myopia. So you can see on the top left here, the image that's about -8 diopter of myopia. And you can see that it's a very small disc. And again, on the left side, even with an axial length of 26.61 millimeters, the disc size is just 1.54 millimeters square. Whereas when you go down here with an axial length of only 23.56, you have a very large optic disc of 3.95 millimeters square, actually. And I'd just like to touch on the evolving shape of the optic disc in myopia. The shape is very, very different in patients of myopia. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And the reason that it's very hard to predict is because there are parameters specifically related to increase in the axial length and where the axial length actually grows and what happens to the Brooks membrane and whether the Brooks membrane gets pushed out, actually. These are the parameters that are associated with the evolving shape. So when you start with the myopic patient, you're not going to be able to imagine what shape the disc is going to be. When you see a young kid of 10 years, you don't know what shape the disc is going to be. when the patient is about 20 or 25 years, because that's not in anyone's hand. So this is a patient that I just thought I'd bring to everyone's notice. It's a myopic patient, and the right eye shows classical glaucoma. This thing, and the left eye, which is highly myopic, has developed a tilted disc, but actually the myopia is a lot less in the left eye, which is very unusual, because when we talk of asymmetricity of glaucoma and myopia, then remember the eye that is more myopic generally will have much more glaucoma than the eye that is less myopic. So this actually goes against the rule of thumb. So the large axial length in myopia often distorts optic disc tissue, both superficial and deep, leading to difficulties in clinical assessment, thus taking away the advantage of comparing with the normal appearing optic disc. And this introduces a greater variability of the appearance of the optic disc in myopia with or without glaucoma. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And can I now call upon Dr. Ashish Thul, sir? He's a senior glaucoma specialist from Nagpur, and he'll be speaking on visual field defects when they aren't glaucoma. Thul, sir?
Thank you, Gunjan. Vinay sir, you need to stop.
I'm just trying to see what how to stop. Yeah, I got it actually. So sorry, the slide is not going off. But,
so we will be discussing visual field defects, which kind of mimic glaucoma in this presentation.
Can you take help from someone to help me? I got it actually. Let me see whether I can. It's not going on to that stop share.
Yeah, can somebody from Numerotech please take over?
Yes, doctor. Few minutes.
Yeah, I got it. There you are.
Yeah.
There you are. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thul, sir,
Yeah.
please, can we have your presentation?
Yeah, sure. So my slides are visible, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Ashish.
So whenever we are having a look at the visual field printout in front of us, what we need to do is answer these three basic questions instead of just looking at this pattern deviation plot and the grayscale. We need to see whether the field is reliable, and then if it is reliable, is there a field defect, and then decide whether it is because of glaucoma or some other disease entity. So in a reliable perimetric printout, if it is abnormal in both eyes and it is respecting the vertical meridian, what we are looking at is a neurocause, a chiasmal or a retrochiasmal lesion. Whereas if it is a field defect, which is because of an anterior visual pathway disease, be it a retinal disorder or an optic nerve disorder, the type of visual field defect that you would get is either a central, paracentral, arcuate or altitudinal scotoma, or a generalized constricted visual field. What is important to understand is you can only make your diagnosis with taking proper history and having a good clinical examination, and then labeling that visual field defect etiology. Optic nerve disorders tend to respect the horizontal meridian. So a defect like this, it is a no-brainer. You have to go for neuroimaging and neuroconsult because it is a neuroophthalmic visual field defect that we are looking at. So what we should do is try and divide the perimetry printout into these 8 zones and do a systematic evaluation so that we don't miss any data and we do not misdiagnose. We look at Anderson's criteria for diagnosing glaucoma, looking at the pattern deviation plot, the GHT and the global indices, the pattern standard deviation. We also know that in a typical field defect in glaucoma, we would have it as in an arcuate pattern, asymmetric across horizontal midline. And in early cases, you would be having it around 5 to 25 degrees from fixation. Importantly, it would be a reproducible defect. It should not be attributable to any other pathology. That means the defect should correlate with the structural changes that you are seeing on the optic nerve head. And in cases of glaucomatous visual field defects, the visual acuity generally will not be affected except when you have very advanced disease or if there is a coexisting cataract or any other pathology. So if you just go by Anderson's criteria and look at this field, you would feel that this is a glaucomatous field defect. But when you do a systematic evaluation and you see that the refractive error of the patient is almost plus 10.5 diopters, then you know that this need not necessarily because of glaucoma unless you have corrected the refractive error with contact lens and then done the field test. And second test, here you can see the total deviation plot is almost normal. The pattern deviation plot is showing few paracentral scotomas. The GST you see is showing abnormally high sensitivity. And then when you look at the raw data carefully, you can see that the peripheral points visual sensitivity at some points is actually higher than the points which are there in the central area. And you see those white scotomas popping out of the gray scale. This tells us that this is a trigger happy patient and this is not a glaucomatous defect at all. This is a fast strategy which has been used. The foveal threshold is less than 0 decibel and not at all correlating with the visual acuity of 6/9. This itself should raise a doubt in your mind. And this is a very atypical defect. You don't find this kind of defect either in glaucomatous field losses or even in other conditions. Maybe in central pathologies of retina macular disorders, sometimes you might expect it. You explain the patient how the test has to be performed properly, get a good test done, and this same patient, because does not have glaucoma or any other disease, comes out with a normal field report. If the reliability criteria itself are very significantly affected, the perimetry printout itself will highlight those for you, and you don't even diagnose this, try to diagnose this the field defect and get a repeat printout which is reliable. This is a patient, a glaucoma suspect, young chap. Initial perimetry report showed some generalized depression in the total deviation plot. You can see some paracentral scotomas there. We repeated the test, then the paracentral scotomas disappeared. What you see is some isolated peripheral depressions. And then the third test, around a month or two later, the patient comes up with normal tests. So we have to keep in mind that there could be element of learning curve effect in certain patients, and that should be kept in mind. So this defect looks like actually a typical, so kind of a superior arcuate glaucomatous field defect, but wherein this patient actually had ptosis, mild to moderate ptosis in this eye. This kind of defects, if it is bilateral and the patient has tilted discs, especially tilted disc like inferior conus on both sides, this can mimic glaucomatous field defect as well. So we need to keep that in mind as well also. So looking at this perimetry printout, you can see that there the Anderson's criteria is kind of getting fulfilled. This is 24-2 test, so edge points also will consider. GST is borderline and PSD value is certainly below the 0.5% probability levels. Looking at the disc, it is actually a large disc. The neuroretinal rim is pretty well maintained all around. You do not see any nerve fibular defect in the inferotemporal as well as superotemporal region. And then when you repeat the test, the defect is not reproduced. So what we are looking at actually is a large physiological disc and not a glaucomatous disc. An advanced glaucomatous field defect on first glance, almost a tubular field. You look at the disc, that is also kind of correlating with your sorry about that. That is also kind of correlating with your clinical findings. But when you dilate the patients, you can see that the disc is kind of little bit pale, and you can see the arterial attenuation and also some perivascular pigmentation, which goes in favor of retinitis pigmentosa, which also can produce a advanced field defect like this. Altitudinal field defects typically are related to ischemic neuropathies, basically non-arthritic AION. So very rarely they can come along with glaucoma, as is the case here. This again is a superior arcuate scotoma that you are looking at, moderate to advanced disease. It is at first glance even correlating with your optic nerve head findings if you are doing it with undilated pupil or you don't pay attention to the stereoscopic evaluation that you should do properly. Just going by the perimetry printout, you can see at the raw data values that the defects are very deep, less than 0 decibel sensitivity at quite a few points. And then we come back and look at the disc, you can make out that this actually is an isolated coloboma of the optic nerve head, and that has resulted into this glaucoma like field defect which we are seeing here. This again inferotemporal or maybe going towards inferonasal field kind of field defect. You look at the fundus of this patient, It is actually produced because of this superotemporal isolated CRA lesion that is present there, and not because of glaucomatous optic nerve head. This is the last interesting case that I wanted to share. A glaucoma suspect referred for evaluation. The disc looks pretty normal. Cupping is there, but the rim is maintained throughout. What you are looking at is a superotemporal kind of field defect, wherein you should have had a retinal nerve fiber layer thinning in the inferonasal quadrant, which is not seen. And when we look at the patient after dilatation, what he is having is a posterior subcapsular cataract in the left eye, more so inferonasally. And because this posterior subcapsular cataract by location is beyond the nodal point, it has reflected or translated into the visual field defect in the superotemporal area. So to sum up, all visual field defects that you see on the perimetry printout are not glaucoma unless you confirm the test reliability. Do a systematic interpretation keeping in mind those 8 zones that we spoke about. Be aware of the learning curve effect in certain individuals. Know your differentials, be it an artifact, be it a congenital optic nerve head disorder. It could be a variation of normal like a physiological cup, or any other retinal disease that could be producing the field defect like glaucoma. Always correlate it clinically with proper history, and you won't be missing glaucoma or non-glaucoma visual field defects. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tul sir. And I'll take over. Mine will be the last presentation. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Again, at the outset, I would like to thank the MOS for accepting our IC, and I'll be speaking on OCT, the red and green disease. Now, why is OCT required? OCT is required to analyze the optic nerve head and the retinal nerve fiber layer, as well as the ganglion cell complex in few cases. Now, this is what a standard SD OCT printout looks like. I have restricted my talk to a Zeiss printout. I have no financial disclosures to make. This is a standard SD OCT printout, and I'll directly take you to the red and green disease, the actual talk of my, the actual topic for today. Now, whenever we take a printout, we have to identify 3 important parameters before we interpret the patient for glaucomatous damage. The first is the signal strength that we can see superiorly. Then is the centration, which has to be seen on the RNFL deviation map. And last is the scan alignment, both on the vertical and the horizontal, vertical, and the circular tomograms. And only when these 3 criteria are met, then the printout should be taken for interpretation. The first, as we know, is the signal strength. It tells us about the intensity and the uniformity of the scan. Anything which is less than 6 should not be considered. I've just taken a small example where we can see that the signal strength in the lower part of the photograph, it is only 3, and therefore we see a very large superior nasal and inferior red defect. And when we improve the signal strength up to 8, this defect just disappears. The next important part, as was said, was poor centration. If we can see in this upper part of the printout, the disc is decentered, and as a result, we see a very large temporal defect. Now, in the lower part of the photograph, when we see that the disc is centered, the temporal defect goes away. This is only due to poor centration. Talking about the RNFL truncation, see, the RNFL thickness can never touch 0. It can never touch the baseline. Why? Because there is always presence of glial tissue and blood vessels at the floor of the optic nerve head, which we know as the floor effect. And because those tissues are present over there, therefore the graph will never touch the baseline. If you can see the lower part in the of the printout on the left side, you can see the circular tomogram, which has been cut on the superior part. This means there was a small, perhaps there was a floater or some PVD which was seen and which encroached upon the examination circle, as we can see superiorly. We also have to check for the circular tomogram. We have to check whether the proper segmentation has been done, because if the segmentation isn't proper, the RNFL thickness calculation will be difficult. As we can see on the left side, the segmentation is very nicely done. On the right side, there is very poor differentiation of the retinal layers, and therefore this can lead to a false RNFL measurement. There are certain artifacts. You can see a small black floater kind of a thing on the thickness map, and which is corresponding to a red defect on the RNFL deviation map. Now, this floater again was encroaching upon the examination circle. And these floaters or these artifacts can be removed by asking the patient to either move the eye or to reposition their head. Yeah, we can see over here. The peripapillary atrophy is a very important, it's an important point to be considered. They can lead to measurement errors. And I think there are two important things that we need to consider in these myopic patients. Myopic patients, they generally have a very thin RNFL as compared to the standard database that we have. And secondly, these patients can be used as their own controls. For example, if there's a patient who presents to you for the first time, you can take a baseline OCT printout and then use this printout as a control for his subsequent sequential follow-ups. A small point that I wanted to say, that the corneal reflex should always be taken care of. You always have to instill artificial tears before taking these patients for an OCT. Another artifact where we can see that everything has been flagged as white and nothing has been flagged as either green or red. And this is because the patient has disc edema, right? And because of the disc edema, we can see very high values on the RNFL, the TSNIT graph. And therefore, the normal RNFL always does not mean a normal disc. Similarly, RNFL loss also does not always mean glaucoma. As we can see in this patient, there's an inferior defect, and which is corresponding on an inferior defect on the Tisnet graph. We have an inferior quadrant defect, but then when we actually see the patient has an inferior coloboma. Yeah, this is and this can be seen into the OCT printout. We have certain patients in which we have temporal or nasal shifted peaks, and because of this shifting of the peaks, the distribution of the normal RNFL changes. The superior goes either nasally or temporally, the inferior bundle either goes nasally or temporally, and therefore this leads to poor alignment with the normative database, and we can have false damage. As we can see in this patient, the patient has a tilted disc over here, and therefore normal average RNFL thickness should also be considered in patients who have an abnormal clock RNFL. A small mention that I wanted to say about high myopia. Now, considering the database, the refractive errors that were included were from +8 to -12, and therefore anything which is more than +8 or more than -12, such patients have to be considered with caution. Such printouts need to be considered with caution. Myopic eyes have a thinner RNFL, as I have already said, as compared to the normal population. The floor effect, I've already mentioned that the RNFL the graph will never touch the baseline, because there's always some amount of glial tissue and blood vessels over there, and it will just never fall off below 40 or 50 micron. Visual fields in such advanced cases will be more helpful than OCTs. Now, there is a catch when we talk about the normative database. Now, this SDOCT had taken data from around 284 healthy individuals, of which only 1% were Indians. Rest maximum were either Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, or either had a mixed ethnicity. And therefore, many results which can be flagged as abnormal. Now, this is statistics, right? So, which can be flagged abnormal may not actually represent the actual disease in such patients. There are certain pros and cons of every machine, as we know. Apart from the advantages, we have limitations of the OCT. Due to either decentration or errors due to PVD, posterior or anterior RNFL misidentification, poor signal, motion artifacts, segmentation errors, limitations either because of scan acquisition or because of the scan interpretation, scan acquisition. We've already discussed media opacities, PPA, miotic pupils, poor fixations, and scan interpretation. Either, I mean, whether it's a good quality scan or not, whether there are artifacts, test, retest, variabilities, whether we consider the normative database, and whether it is actually clinically correlating. Now, just to sum up, I would like to say that the OCT is a very powerful tool for structural evaluation of the optic nerve head, and whatever that we see on the OCT should not be taken in isolation. Practically any investigation that we do in glaucoma we should never be taken in isolation. Always and always correlate it with the other investigations and with the clinical findings. Yeah, the art of glaucoma diagnosis is to critically analyze the data from all these machines, as I've said, and combine it with our knowledge to formulate a very proper plan for our patients. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, speakers. I have received on my personal WhatsApp, there's a question for Thul sir. How should we go ahead with the cases of acute angle closure who present with disc edema? I mean, I think it is probably regarding the serial visual field defects that we can see when the disc edema gradually subsides and the glaucomatous optic atrophy finally sets in.
In the setting of acute angle closure, we are more concerned with managing that acute angle closure rather than even trying to subject the patient for perimetry. That is one thing. Once the angle closure subside, that disc edema also will go away. And then what you have would be an advanced kind of field defect or a moderately affected glaucomatous field defect, depending on how long the angle closure with that high intraocular pressure was there. Then you can get your perimetry printout done as a new baseline for this patient and manage accordingly.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And there's one question for Nangya, sir. Sir, they want to know, how do the disc tilts affect the RNFL distribution?
That it's the disc tilt does affect the RNFL distribution, and there is a possibility that that till the time that glaucoma occurs, you may end up seeing thinning superiorly. Let's say that the disc tilt is classically inferior or inferonasal with the parapupillary atrophy zone inferiorly. Then there's a possibility that that if it's a normal scan, not based on the Brooks membrane opening, but based on centration on the optic disc, then there's a possibility that you will get some thickening inferiorly and you may get some thinning superiorly. But this is not a hard and fast rule. If you get thickening inferiorly, then it also means that there would not be significant tessellation inferiorly and there would not be significant choroidal thinning inferiorly. But if there is significant tessellation and significant choroidal thinning inferiorly, as it often happens, if the parapupillary atrophy or the gamma zone is inferior, then that may obviate the thickening that you're normally expected to get in such patients. So there's no hard and fast. One of the important things about the retinal nerve fiber layer is that at the earliest sign of suspicion, which is, let's say that the patient doesn't have classically elevated pressures, but you suspect that the patient has glaucoma, then the first thing that you can do is to try and not only just get the photographs and get a wide field visual field, but also do a basic retinal nerve fiber layer, both centered on the optic disc and centered around the Brooks membrane opening. And that will form the baseline so that when the patient comes in the future, you will have some degree of correlation and comparison with the baseline.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And thank you, Dr. Aditya, also for your presentation. I think there's only one thing that we could have added. Yeah, maybe we can discuss it right now about dilated gonioscopy.
Yeah.
You covered gonioscopy very well. I think dilated gonioscopy will help us identifying whether the lens is the actual cause for angle closure.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any more
questions. Many a time, we also neglect gonioscopy by just seeing the antechamber depth, but We have to make sure that every patient in glaucoma clinic, we should do gonioscopy. It happens in a busy OPD sometimes.
Yeah, it does. It does. I think that is all for today for our IC. Thank you so much. Thank you, Thul sir,
Thank you.
Nangia sir,
Thank
Dr.
you,
Aditya,
everyone.
Dr. Shilpa.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you